Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out today. 9 years after the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call from the Palestinian civil society, we would like to welcome you to the 10th annual Israeli Apartheid Week. Israeli Apartheid Week began right here in Toronto 10 years ago, and since then it has taken place in over 200 cities worldwide. In light of the significance of the 10th annual IAW and our distinguished panel that builds bridges between South Africa, Palestine, and Canada, we would like to take a moment to memorialize Nelson Mandela's passing and pay tribute to his legacy by continuing the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. Furthermore, we would like to recognize that as we gather here today, we assert our opposition to colonialism and apartheid and our solidarity with indigenous struggles for self-determination. We, as the organizers of Israeli Apartheid Week in Toronto, believe that we cannot speak meaningfully about Israeli apartheid without acknowledging and first speaking about the realities of apartheid here in Canada. Canada's reservation system and treatment of indigenous people was closely studied by the planners of apartheid in South Africa. From its very foundations, Canada has been based on the theft of indigenous land and the genocide and displacement of indigenous people. This colonial project continues to this day, encroaching on native land with subdivisions and highways, environmental devastation, and the reality of hundreds of disappeared and missing Native women. In the face of more than 500 years of colonialism, indigenous communities continue to resist. As non-natives, we have a role within our own communities to further the process of decolonizing Canada. If you are with us in the opposition to Israeli apartheid, we encourage your consistent opposition to apartheid right here in Canada. From Palestine to Turtle Island, there is no justice on stolen land. I will now introduce to the podium Alan Sears from Faculty for Palestine, who will introduce the speakers.
It's wonderful to see everybody here today. I think as we meet for this 10th annual Israeli Apartheid Week, we can really think that we are seeing a turning point in the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in support of Palestinian rights. We are seeing the movement which is really on the verge of turning into a mass movement, and that's reaching a new scale of support in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere in the world, in India and certainly in South Africa. We've seen groups like the American Studies Association and the Native Studies Association in the United States endorse academic boycott. Just last weekend, I don't know if people here have been following this, the University of Windsor students, undergraduate students in a referendum, as opposed to just the student union voting, in a referendum actually voted to support boycott, divestment, sanctions. Now that takes a lot of work by students to actually persuade other students to open up the conversation and so on. We've seen, because of these struggles that are taking place in unions, in academic situations, among students, and in other places like this, we're actually seeing the campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions becoming speakable in new ways. And even publications like the New York Times have actually carried debate about boycott, divestment, and sanctions in ways that just wouldn't have happened 3, 4, 5 years ago. That is happening is a tribute to people in this room, to people in Toronto who started Israeli Apartheid Week, to the incredible struggle of people in Palestine who've carried on despite the difficulties of the struggle. The Palestine boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, the campaign in support of Palestinian rights, was deliberately modeled on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, with its combination of international support with a powerful struggle inside. And the international movement around South African apartheid and around Israeli apartheid now is based largely on naming the responsibility of those who are complicit in the actions of maintaining apartheid through trade, through all kinds of activities that actually normalize the oppressive regime and so on. And we're very fortunate tonight that we are going to have speakers addressing the current situation in Palestine, addressing the current movement, and addressing the historic movement against apartheid in South Africa that is so important for us to be learning from. And someone in the person of Yusuf Saloojee, who was actually present in this city at the time when the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the Solidarity movement, moved from being a kind of basic movement to a mass movement that had impact all over the place. So without further ado, we're going to move to the speakers, and to introduce the first speaker, I'm going to very briefly introduce Yusuf Saloojee, who is actually the president of my union, the Ryerson Faculty Association. Anwar is a dedicated anti-racism activist and scholar. His research and his activism and his teaching are all combined around themes of decolonizing, struggling against racism, struggling for justice in all kinds of ways. He's actually played a very important role in turning a faculty association, which can sometimes be simply a place that defends the privileges of relatively privileged faculties, into a social justice organization in the time of his presidency, and it's been great to work with him in a number of ways. He's an expert on the anti-apartheid movement, both here and in South Africa, and played a role at both ends of the struggle. And he's going to introduce our first speaker, Yusuf Saloojee. So Anwar, if you could come up and introduce
thank you for having me here. Friends and colleagues, I'm honored to have been asked to do two things by the organizers tonight. And first is to say a few words about the historical connection between apartheid South Africa and Israel. And the second, to introduce one who's no stranger to us, and certainly not to me, friend, colleague, and relative. But I should also call him ambassador, because he was the ambassador for the post-apartheid government to many countries in the Middle East. So, and that's Yusuf Saloojee, our speaker for tonight. And I'll say a few more words about him shortly. You know, in 1976, the South African government's handbook said, Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. They are both situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark peoples. And that same year, 1976, the South African Prime Minister at that time, John Foster, arrived at the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem with his diplomatic retinue in tow, and he paid his respects to the victims of the Holocaust. But let's not forget that this is the same John Foster with his intelligence chief, Hendrik van den Berg, who served as generals in the OP, a militant Afrikaner nationalist organization that supported the Nazis during the Second World War. And Foster is on record as having said that in Germany they called it National Socialism, Nazism. In South Africa we call it, he says, the ideology of apartheid, Christian nationalism. We see no difference. So at its core, that relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa is a relationship, a marriage of interests, of ideologies, where Israel profited handsomely by selling arms and exporting arms to South Africa, and South Africa gained access to cutting-edge weaponry at a time when the world was turning against apartheid. So it was truly a marriage of ideology and a marriage of intense convenience. And that marriage lasted a good 20 years with really truly a Janus-faced Israel denying its ties with South Africa and covertly engaging in the production of, jointly, the production of weapons of mass destruction with South Africa. Israel and South Africa came together at an auspicious time, and the alliance in the early 1970s, and particularly right after the Yom Kippur War, was one of a military alliance and an economic relationship for 2.5 decades. Both were states that were on the verge of being isolated. They formed an unholy alliance that allowed South Africa to develop nuclear technology, and that's really the most important part of what I'd like to say, is that Israel helped South Africa develop its nuclear weaponry at a time when no one else was giving South Africa access to that. And in return, they also, Israel at the United Nations denied that it had any relationships with South Africa. So from the mid-1970s onwards, the two countries were covertly engaging in joint nuclear weapons development, including the testing of nuclear weapons. And there was the famous 1979 Vela incident where the United States, I think it was the CIA, picked up a flash over the Atlantic Ocean and then decided, after doing some investigation, that in fact it was the detonation of a nuclear weapon by South Africa and jointly by South Africa and Israel. But in 2010, the Guardian newspaper released South African government documents that it alleges confirmed the existence of Israel's nuclear arsenal and confirmed that Israel and South Africa were engaging in joint discussions whereby Israel offered to sell nuclear warheads to South Africa in return for a fairly hefty sum of money. And then they also engaged in trade of uranium. The top secret minutes of the meeting between the two senior officials from the two countries in 1975 showed that South Africa's Defense Minister, P.W. Botha, asked for the warheads, and Shimon Peres, then Israel's Defense Minister, and subsequently its president, responded by offering them in 3 separate sizes. So whichever size you wanted, they would customize the nuclear weaponry for South Africa. The two men signed a broad-ranging agreement governing military ties between the two countries that included a clause declaring the very existence of this agreement was to remain secret from the two parties. The Israeli authorities subsequently, in post-apartheid South Africa, stopped the ANC government from declassifying this particular document that was signed by PW and by Shimon Peres. And they argued that this would undermine Israel's attempts to bring peace in the Middle East. And a spokesman for Peres said that the report was baseless and there was never any negotiations between the two countries, but did not comment on the authenticity of the document, which has Peres' signature on it. Amongst those in attendance at the meeting was the South African Military Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Armstrong. He drew up a memo in which he laid out the benefits to South Africa of obtaining missiles, particularly the Jericho missile, only if they were outfitted with nuclear weapons. Eventually the deal didn't go through, it wasn't consummated, but there's no doubt that Shimon Peres took part in the discussions just because the price was too high for South Africa. Some weeks before Peres made his offer of warheads to Botha, the two defense ministers signed a covert agreement governing the military alliance known as SACMENT, S-E-C-M-E-N-T. It was so secret that it included a denial of its own existence. Quote, "It is hereby expressly agreed that the very existence of this agreement shall be secret and shall not be disclosed by either party." So the collaboration was secret, it was intense, and it allowed both parties to develop weapons of mass destruction. And it's quite clear that South Africa's missiles thereafter, the RSA-3 and 4 ballistic missiles, were absolutely similar to the Shavet and Jericho missiles that Israel had. So it was quite clear that Israel had sold the plans for the missiles to South Africa, who in turn then used it to arm its missiles with nuclear warheads. And at the time of the ANC being unbanned in 1989, South Africa had at least 6 missiles, and a seventh one that was underway, and all thanks to the negotiations between the two parties, and I'm sure Yusuf will talk a bit more about that. All of those were dismantled, and South Africa, in transition, was the first country to actually decide on its own to unilaterally dismantle its own nuclear warheads. So now to my second task. Jojo, Yusuf is no stranger to us. In 1978, he established the ANC offices in Toronto. He was our first chief representative here. And probably I would say, he'll maybe disagree, but our longest serving chief representative in any country for the ANC. And we had offices in London, throughout many of the frontline states, in Africa, in Asia, in India as well. And I think, Jojo, you were the longest serving chief representative, right? That's not a comment on your age, but it is a comment on your, the testimony of what you actually did for us. He then, as chief representative, he worked incredibly hard for us. And he's only now getting his pension for all of those days. We didn't pay him very much, but fortunately he gets a pension from the government because he was a full-time employee. The role of the chief rep at that time was to highlight the struggle, develop a greater deal of consciousness in the population at large about the anti-apartheid struggle, about the ANC, and about the challenges that the people of South Africa were facing at the hands of the apartheid regime. Upon leaving Canada, he was deployed to the ANC's international department in Lusaka, where he worked with the then president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, and as well he worked with Thabo Mbeki, who then became president of South Africa for 2 terms. And while in Lusaka, I think he really tried to shape up both OR's office and Thabo's office, because one of Yusuf's strengths is he has an incredible capacity to organize and to think methodically. At the end of apartheid, when South Africa's, after the democratic dispensation, the ANC came to power, and Yusuf was appointed ambassador for the democratic government. He served as an ambassador in Oman, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Of this tour, he said, I once traveled the length and breadth of Canada, raising awareness of apartheid South Africa's oppressive policies against black South Africans, as well as garnering support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against apartheid South Africa. Initially, the Canadian government and its people were reluctant to support our struggle against apartheid, but with time, both the Canadian government and the Canadian people were fully behind our struggle. They chose to be on the right side of history. The Canadian government and the people are now being called on to once again be on the right side of history by supporting the Palestinian people in their struggle against Israeli apartheid. Canada, Yusuf says, should live up to its past track record and throw its weight behind the international Palestinian solidarity movement and with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel campaign. So without much ado, please welcome Yusuf back to Canada.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the BDS here in Toronto for inviting me to this august ceremony, the 10th anniversary. This is a very familiar place to me, as Enver has pointed out, particularly this venue, because we had very many anti-apartheid activities here, and some in conjunction with the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. So I'm very familiar with this venue, and it's a great pleasure to see so many of you who are so familiar to me and me familiar to you, of course. Before I raise the issue of BDS and the Palestinian struggle, I think we can draw examples from my own experiences here. I was sent by the ANC, my studies were disrupted, and I was called in by the then president of the ANC, the late Oliver Tambo, who said, "We are sending you to Canada to raise awareness and raise funds." And I thought, that is a mighty task. I'm not so sure whether I can. But I arrived here looking for support and found it extremely difficult. I went to religious organizations, to the United Church, to the Anglican Church, to the Catholic Church. They all express their disfavor of apartheid, their antagonism towards apartheid, but they didn't think that they could do much, and certainly couldn't support the ANC. Same thing with many of the trade unions. As far as political parties were concerned, when I arrived here, it was the Liberal Party that was in power, and at the United Nations and international level, they merely paid lip service to an anti-apartheid struggle. But in practice, and as the vote will indicate, records will show, in most resolutions against apartheid, they either abstained or voted against. So it was a tough battle. But I was determined, together with the likes of Enver and a number of others here, including John Piper and so forth, determination to continue to fight, because we had faith in the Canadian people, because they have a deep sense of justice. And it took a long time. But by the time I left in '89, it was very interesting, because the biggest rally against, candlelight ceremony against apartheid was organized by the Conservative government of Canada. And I'm sure some of you will recall, there was this highlighted anti-apartheid event here, right here in Toronto, addressed by Bishop Desmond Tutu and organized again by the Conservative Party of Canada. I think, in the first instance it was Joe Clark, in the second instance it was Brian Mulroney. The first, one of the few countries to which Oliver Tambo was invited in the Western world, in Canada, was by Brian Mulroney. Remember, he was supposed to be a revolutionary left-wing leader, but invited by the Conservative Party. Student bodies, trade unions, and political parties played an important role. Now, it's important because there are 3 or 4 main factors that changed the situation in South Africa. One was, of course, the internal political struggle organized by the underground forces of the ANC, as well as others. Second one was the international movement, particularly sanctions against South Africa. And despite the fact that many Western governments opposed sanctions in the beginning, the leading role at the end of the day was taken by the US in promulgating the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. So what I'm trying to say is, for those, well, during that time, the question was, will apartheid ever end? And we had a standard answer, yes, it would. It would end not because of anything, but because of people around the world supporting, conscientious that it is a just struggle and supporting it. And it made the civic society, the trade union movement, the student bodies are the ones who made their government change their minds, including here in Canada. I recall that in Sweden, which was a very strong anti-apartheid supporter and a very strong supporter of the ANC, that elections depended on what the position of the political parties were really anti-apartheid struggle. So, we were told that time it is impossible. It is impossible to overthrow the apartheid regime because it is very powerful, economically very sound, and virtually impossible. But we as South Africans, particularly in the ANC, together with the international community, were determined that change would come. I'm saying so because there are those who say things in Israel-Palestine will never change. But if you maintain that discipline and that determination, that change is possible. If not today, maybe tomorrow or the day after. It has to come. There are those who say that the position that you take against Israel is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. It's neither one of those two. It is the same as in South Africa. Although it was a struggle for racial equality and to bring about a true democratic South Africa in which all South Africans had equal rights, it is no different than the struggle of the Palestinians in Israel. Enver has raised one issue of similarities. Let me raise another from a personal experience. In 2003, I accompanied former Minister of Defense, Ronnie Kasrils, and former Deputy Foreign Minister, Aziz Bahad, on a visit to Palestine. One of the things we saw, or some of the things we saw, we stood in front of this monstrosity, the 8-foot wall. If you have to go there personally and see that wall, you will begin to wonder what kind of humans build things like this and for what purpose. Right next to the wall, we visited a family, a mother, old lady, who invited us for tea. And she was crying because she said her young son lives on the other side of the wall, whom she used to see every day. Now she's lucky if she can see him once a month. We went to the checkpoint, and the method of torture and inhuman treatment of Palestinians at the checkpoint, of men, women, and children, will make you cry. So, and in our discussions with the Palestinians, including a number of Palestinian political prisoners who have been released, who told us their plight of torture, we began to feel, all three of us, to say to deal with apartheid was much easier than the Israeli atrocities against the Palestinians. We had Bantustans in South Africa, which segregated the different tribes under what was called an independent, but none of them had walls built like that. It is in that context that the International Court of Justice declared on July 9th of 2004, declared that wall illegal and demanded that it be dismantled. I myself spent, under the 90-day detention act, I spent 87 days in solitary confinement. And I thought that was bad. But when I heard the stories of Israeli torturers torturing Palestinians, ours looked like paradise. Really it did. We thought the Bantustans in South Africa were bad, but after being in Palestine and after listening to Palestinians about their plight, including to Yasser Arafat, we realized that the struggle of the Palestinians will be much harder. It is in that context, you should remember that the Palestinians and the South African struggle have a very strong historical background and link. We shared many, many international platforms simply because we understood each other's struggle. But I understood it better once I visited Palestine. It is in that context that President Nelson Mandela, after visiting many, many countries, had refused to go to Israel. It is in that context that Bishop Desmond Tutu made the linkage between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. It is out of a deep understanding that the former defense minister, Ronnie Kasrils, says, not in my name, being a Jew, you can't equate me with the current Israeli state. The ANC on Sunday, March 3rd, past Sundays, March 2nd, officially endorsed the BDS movement, and it was joined by the trade union movement in South Africa very widely, by student unions, by schools, universities, NGOs, in marking the 10th anniversary of the BDS. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Maite Mashapane, had issued a statement last year saying South African ministers or deputy ministers should not visit Israel. The Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Ibrahim, a few months ago, issued a statement discouraging all South Africans from visiting Israel. Question is, how do we solve that problem? Anwar has outlined some of the collaboration between the state of Israel and apartheid, not only in the military sense, but in ideological sense as well. The racism that was practiced under apartheid South Africa constitutionally is no different than the racism practiced in the state of Israel today. So it doesn't matter what religion you come from, what country you come from, where you are from. If you are honest to yourself and if you have a conscience to say justice must be served, and where there is an injustice, it is your duty as a human being to fight it regardless of what religion you come from. Palestinians need our support, not worldwide, as strongly as struggle against apartheid. You know, one of the questions I often asked when I was that side, when I was in Palestine as well as to the Israeli side, I asked the Israelis the question, what about the teachings? 10 Commandments which says thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. So why do you kill every single day? And why do you steal the land of the Palestinians every day? And the answer to that, that's a different issue, a different subject. Right? We have a right to kill if necessary. And we're not stealing, we're taking land that belongs to us. Same kind of excuses that the apartheid regime in South Africa uses. My main appeal tonight is to appeal to all of you. Just as you supported the anti-apartheid struggle, you need to intensify the campaign. Boycott, disinvestments, and sanctions against Israel. Those who said in the struggle against apartheid that sanctions won't work are the same people that are now saying sanctions against Israel is not the way to go. But it is the way to go. Just as it helped us to bring about a free, non-racial, democratic South Africa, so will it help the Israelis. I'm not too sure, personally, whether I support a two-state solution anymore. I think like South Africa, you should have a single state with a single constitution for all human beings, regardless of what their background is. I thank you once again. I hope that my visit here will help towards the struggle of the Palestinian people. And I take this opportunity in concluding to say 4 days away is International Women's Day. So I congratulate that day, not only to the women of the world who are in the forefront of the struggle. In South Africa they played an active role, and they are doing so in Israel as well. So I wish them all the best. Thank you very much.